Hi everyone. This is the fifth video on the series called The Truth About Psychiatry. Today I would like to call our theme, the overarching theme of this video, the myth of mental illness. And this is to follow up on the, the four previous videos. So if you haven't seen those, go ahead and start with the first one. It'll make more sense as you watch the earlier videos that it builds up to what we're talking about today. And in this video, I would like to talk a little bit more about Thomas Szasz and his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, and share a brief biographical note from his book. And I did write a blog post on this book soon after I read it, so I'd like to go through that blog post and probably just read a majority of it and comment, and also find passages from Thomas Szasz' book, The Myth of Mental Illness, that will be the substance of our discussion today. I would also like to point out that on my Psychiatric Survivors blog, I do have blog posts on the previous books that we've discussed, including Ethan Waters' book, Crazy Like Us, and Peter Bregin's book, Toxic Psychiatry and Medication Madness, and Irving Kirsch's book, The Emperor's New Drugs. So those are on the Truth About Psychiatry blog post on the Psychiatric Survivors blog, and I'll include links at the bottom of the page. And just briefly, before we get into Szasz and the myth of mental illness, I want to introduce a couple of other authors that'll be important going forward. One of whom has recently passed away, a woman named Bonnie Burstow. She's written several books, including a creative book on electroshock. I think it's a novel that she wrote to kind of portray the horrors and the evils of electroshock. But she also has a few books that I've read that we'll discuss in the future videos. One called Psychiatry Disrupted, another called Psychiatry Interrogated, and a great book that she wrote, Psychiatry and the Business of Madness. And these all follow in the themes that we've been discussing with Robert Whitaker and Peter Breggin. I think Bonnie Burstow goes even deeper into the history of psychiatry, and she is a little different. She's not a psychiatrist like Breggin or Szasz, and she's not just a journalist or investigative journalist like Robert Whitaker. She's more, well, she's an interesting lady who, she passed away recently, but she was at University of Toronto, and she even set up a scholarship for anti-psychiatry to fund research into anti-psychiatry. And we'll talk about what psychiatry is, what anti-psychiatry means, and Thomas Szasz actually has some interesting commentary on what anti-psychiatry means, because there's different ways that it's been defined and it's been used, and there are correct ways, there are incorrect ways, and there's better ways. Burstow is very, very much like Szasz. She's an abolitionist. She calls for the abolition of psychiatry, and for my taste, she's much too far on the left, too radical, too Marxist, too utopian in her theorizing, but she's actually right about a lot of things, and so I take all the utopian, fantastical ideas with a grain of salt. So, but she's actually very helpful in understanding what modern psychiatry is and what modern anti-psychiatry is. And she's also published frequently on Robert Whitaker's blog, Mad in America. So that's Bonnie Burstow. Another book that I wanted to mention is a book by Gary Greenberg. Gary Greenberg was somehow involved or connected with the group of people that created the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, and he wrote a book called The Book of Woe, the DSM, and the Unmaking of Psychiatry. And I would like to discuss that book and maybe Bonnie Burstow in a future video. In this book, The Book of Woe, helps us understand how we have now this Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and what it is, how it was created, who were the people involved, why did they do what they did, and what the implications of the creation of that book are. And so there's also a blog post for that book on the Psychiatric Survivors website. So those are some things to look forward to. So if I could just briefly summarize what we've talked about. We've talked about Cracked, the Unhappy Truth About Psychiatry, basically uncovering the ways that psychiatry has manipulated people and the ways that it has harmed innocent people and mostly done so under the guise of medicine and healing. We've talked about Robert Whitaker, Mad in America, and Anatomy of an Epidemic, books where he reveals the history of psychiatry in the United States and also the modern history of psychiatry and how this new or ongoing epidemic of so-called mental illness was actually created by psychiatry. And he has all the science and history and statistics and sound reasoning to back that up. So I recommend all those books. And all of those lead us to Thomas Szasz, who, in my opinion, was the best critic of psychiatry, the most thorough and the brightest and most eloquent, and also the most ignored or the most misunderstood. And, all of these authors that I mentioned have talked about Thomas Szasz. Not all of them have really understood him correctly, in my opinion. But that's why we're going to talk about him. He's written many books, not just dozens, but several dozens of books, and I've read a lot of them, many of them. But we're starting with The Myth of Mental Illness because it was such a groundbreaking book and it was such a controversial book. So let me go ahead and just start reading from my blog posts on The Myth of Mental Illness that I wrote a long time ago when I first read the book. And I'll pause occasionally to comment, and gradually we'll work into the book itself. And there are quotes from the book and ideas that we'll discuss. And so this video on the myth of mental illness I'd also like to dedicate to people who are currently suffering or struggling under a supposed diagnosis of mental illness, whether it be MDD, major depression, whether it be bipolar disorder, whether it be schizophrenia. Like, heaven forbid such an awful label to be given to anyone. But people who are suffering, whether in their homes or whether in the euphemistically called mental hospitals, which would more correctly be called prisons or torture chambers. And Thomas Szasz points out why that's the case. So I'd like to dedicate this video to them and to anyone at all, whether the people themselves or family members who have loved ones who are struggling under the false notion of mental illness. So basically, the 1960 issue of the American Psychologist featured a revolutionary article, one that was deliberately excluded from every major psychiatric journal at the time, written by Thomas Szasz, MD. The title of the article was "The Myth of Mental Illness." This piece began with the following statement, quote, "My aim in this essay is to raise the question, is there such a thing as mental illness? And to argue that there is not." At first glance, such a statement may sound absurd, but Szasz later published an entire book on the same topic and with the same title, The Myth of Mental Illness. More than half a century later, Szasz wrote a new preface to his book, observing that, quote, "In the 1950s, when I wrote The Myth of Mental Illness, the notion that it is the responsibility of the federal government to provide health care to the American people had not yet entered the national consciousness." Unquote. Today, however, the notion that it is the responsibility of the federal government, this is my commentary, to provide health care is so ingrained in the national consciousness that to suggest otherwise, at least in some circles, borders on political heresy. How did this happen? And is mental illness really a myth? Is there really no such thing as mental illness? Szasz went on to explain in the new preface to his book that, quote, 50 years ago, the question, what is mental illness, was of interest to the general public, as well as to philosophers, sociologists, and medical professionals. This is no longer the case. The question has been answered, dismissed would be more accurate, by the holders of political power representing the state. They decree that mental illness is a disease like any other. Political power and professional self-interest unite in turning a false belief into a lying fact. So I like how Szasz starts out his book because he's stating very clearly that his observations run counter to commonly accepted opinions, whether about mental illness, whether about the federal government. Szasz was a little bit too much of a libertarian for me, for my taste, and he also has some confused and confusing ideas about religion. But when it comes to mental illness, I think, or the so-called category of mental illness, he's very accurate and more well-read and understanding than most anyone, even among modern critics of psychiatry or anti-psychiatrists. So, and I also like that idea of, questioning why do we think it's the federal government's job to provide health care, as if, that the federal government is some, giant doctor that's to take care of all citizen patients. I think maybe it's a natural outgrowth of what happens when two sides of the same coin, when the individualism, radical individualism, and a radical statism, become the governing principles of a society instead of what the founders had in mind, or what ancient republics had in mind with republics of virtue, or republics oriented towards other goods. So let's get back to this blog post on Szasz. So Szasz went on to explain in the new preface to his book that 50 years ago, the question, what is mental illness, was of interest to the general public as well as to philosophers, sociologists, and medical professionals. This is no longer the case. The question has So, okay, I guess I just read that. Political power and professional self-interest unite in turning a false belief into a lying fact. So, at one point, I mean, during Sasz's lifetime, um, and he died not too long ago, but still in the 21st century. After a long and illustrious career, um, let's see, what was I going to say? Um, oh yeah, so the question, what is mental illness? I mean, nowadays, if you were to ask someone that, what kind of answers do you think? I mean, I would be curious. What do you think it is? You can share below what you think it is, and um, at the time when Saz was writing, or just before that, it was a question that people were debating. And now, I think, as Saz rightly points out, it has become, because of political power and professional self-interest, it has turned a false belief, that is the belief in mental illness, into a lying fact. So now it's almost taken for granted. If anyone, I mean, you hear it talked about all the time in the media, in casual conversation, even in church congregations. I mean, you'll hear people talk about mental illness all the time, assuming that it's an actual thing and that there are actual um, that it's a category that corresponds directly with some real underlying um, biological, neurological abnormality. Which, if you take a moment to press people a little bit, it'd be interesting because there's never been any sort of test, or blood test or brain scan or anything like that. We'll get into those kind of things later. But the reality is, as Saz points out in this book, is that although we talk about mental illness as if it's an illness like any other, like diabetes or cancer or something like that, it's obviously not the same thing. And not only that, it's mythical in nature. Now, let me be careful here, because this is not to suggest that people who have been labeled with a mental illness, or people who suffer in any way, and even if they call their suffering by the names that are given in the DSM-5, this is not to say that the suffering isn't real, that people don't experience hardship and trauma and suffering of an emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical nature. That's part of mortality. That's part of life. Um, it's just to say that the way that we talk about it has been obscured by a history that is mostly hidden to the general public, and Saz helps bring that history to the foreground. So I continue. Although Saz was a keen observer and a skillful social critic, perhaps a portion of the previous statement deserves further examination. Saz claimed that the question, what is mental illness, was no longer of interest to the general public, philosophers, sociologists, and medical professionals. But he made this claim based on the reception of his work among his critics. Although the question, what is mental illness, has often been dismissed, as Saz argues, it has not been satisfactorily answered, and is therefore still worthy of discussion. In fact, whether or not it can be satisfactorily answered, the question may be of more interest now than it ever was before. I think that's true when I wrote this, and I think it's even more true now. But I do think Saz answered the question quite satisfactorily, if that's how you say it, or at least to my satisfaction. But it's a question that's, obviously I'm making this video because it's something I think needs to be discussed and understood. In the new preface to his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, Saz continued, the claim that mental illnesses are diagnosable disorders of the brain is not based on scientific research. It is a lie, an error, or a naive revival of the somatic premise of the long discredited humoral theory of disease. My claim that mental illnesses are fictitious illnesses is also not based on scientific research. It rests upon the materialist scientific definition of illness as a pathological alteration of cells, tissues, and organs. If we accept this scientific definition of disease, then it follows that mental illness is a metaphor, and that asserting that view is asserting an analytic truth not subject to empirical falsification. So that last paragraph maybe sounds a little complex, but in essence, what Szasz is saying is the way we talk about disease matters. And Szasz is a proponent of the Virchovian, I think his name is Virchow, the definition of disease that has to do with observable, measurable, quantifiable, scientific observations of disease. So, cells that are in disrepair, or cancers or tumors, or things that you can actually find. And so Szasz is trying to distinguish between the metaphorical nature of mental illness and the scientific and observable nature of a real illness. And that'll become more clear as we go forward. So, let's see. If the notion of mental illness is not based upon the scientific definition of disease, and is merely a metaphor, and this is back to my essay, what can doctors possibly mean by diagnosing patients with mental illness? Now, what is a psychiatrist doing when he diagnoses? And Szasz will point out that it's not really a diagnosis; it's more of a label. What are they doing when they label people with mental illness? Since mental illness is not really a scientific or a medical phenomenon, what can it possibly be? Szasz explained, I insisted that the mental hospitals are like prisons, not hospitals, that involuntary mental hospitalization is a type of imprisonment, not medical care, and that coercive psychiatrists function as judges and jailers, not healers. I suggested that we view and understand mental illness and psychiatric responses to them as matters of law and rhetoric, not matters of medicine and science. So he's trying to tease apart the scientific and the medical he's teasing apart the metaphorical and the real. So there are real diseases that are really measurable and really diagnosable by doctors who are trained in those fields. And then on the other hand, there's psychiatry. Szasz also insisted that his thesis was not a fresh insight, nor was it a new discovery. The reason why such arguments seem new was, as Szasz explained, because we have replaced the old religious humanistic perspective on the tragic nature of life with a modern, dehumanized, pseudo-medical perspective on it. In other words, the notion of mental illness grew out of the secularization of everyday life and the, quote, medicalization of the soul and of suffering of all kinds. So Szasz is a little bit too hard on religion, but he does make some good points, because there were obviously some pretty disastrous abuses of religious authority and religious or theological insights that Szasz, I think, it kind of obscures his thinking a little bit on religion, but his basic point is, I think, mostly true, that we have replaced the old religious humanistic perspective on the tragic nature of life with a modern, dehumanized, pseudo-medical perspective on it. And this is a theme that is throughout all of Szasz's writings, and it's a theme that basically I would say Szasz is an atheist, so I disagree with him about that. He's wrong about that, and he's wrong about his, his being too libertarian. But he's right that um, that religion has been replaced with a new religion. So, but instead of acknowledging that there is true religion, there are faithful believers in a true God. Um, he is just saying that the modern religion is a new false religion that replaced the old false religion. So the new false religion is the religion of pseudo medical, pseudoscience, the medicalization of the soul and the suffering of all kinds. Um, then I go on, disagree if you will, but not without first understanding the substance of Szasz' thesis. In essence, Szasz was arguing that the behaviors we call mental illness, to which we attach the hundreds of derogatory labels in our lexicon of lunacy, are not medical diseases. What are they? Quote, they are the products of the medicalization of disturbing or disturbed behaviors, that is, of the observer's construction and definition of the behavior of the persons he observes as medically disabled individuals needing treatment. This cultural transformation is driven mainly by the modern therapeutic ideology that has replaced the old theological worldview and the political and professional interests it sets in motion. In the body of this book, The Myth of Mental Illness, Szasz took into consideration the economic, moral, political, social, and medical forces that played a role in the shaping of modern psychiatry. In doing so, he traced the invention of so-called mental illness to Charcot and the problem of hysteria. Before Charcot, and Charcot was one of Freud's leading teachers. Before Charcot, illness was primarily understood to be a bodily disorder resulting from visible physical causes. As dissection and anatomy began to form the basis of medical science, psychiatry took a different route. Quote, it is important to understand clearly, wrote Szasz in the introduction to The Myth of Mental Illness, that modern psychiatry and the identification of new psychiatric diseases began not by identifying such diseases by means of the established methods of pathology, but by creating a new criterion of what constitutes disease. To the established criterion of the detectable alteration of bodily structure was now added the fresh criterion of alteration of bodily function. That's an important point. So Szasz is noticing a shift from disease defined as the alteration of bodily structure to disease defined as the alteration of bodily function. And as the former was detected by observing the patient's body, so bodily structure, observing the body, so the latter was detected by observing his behavior. So bodily function, observing behavior. So, and there was, after Charcot and Freud, there's obviously a rise in what has been called behaviorism, and all these different branches of psychology that are ostensibly to a scientific field of study to understand human behavior, but the science of that is obviously very debatable. Thus, whereas in modern medicine new diseases were discovered, in modern psychiatry they were invented. Now that's one of the most important points that Szasz makes. So he's not anti-science, he's not anti-medicine, because real science, real medicine have to do with discovering actual diseases. Like there's a real thing called malaria. There are viruses. There's HIV. There's we have our wonderful Wuhan coronavirus right now. It's a real, actual thing. But whereas in modern medicine diseases are discovered, psychiatry creates or invents so-called diseases. And as we've seen in our book, where did I put it? It's back here somewhere. Crazy Like Us. as we've read there, these inventions of diseases have, I mean, terrible implications, terrible consequences when they're exported, whether they're in the United States or whether they're exported to other countries. Um, the invention of new functional illnesses, beginning with hysteria, has multiplied and continues to multiply indefinitely, filling volumes such as the ominous and opprobrious Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. Such inventions, to the detriment of many, have become synonymous with, or at least parallel to, conventionally discovered biological illnesses. The result is that, absent fixed criteria and empirical evidence, quote, any phenomenon studied by the observer may be defined as disease. And then, as we'll see in a future video, as we go through Gary Greenberg's book, The Book of Woe, we'll see how these diseases, these invented diseases, have just proliferated, and how they've been used is really astounding. To this last point, there are innumerable examples of diseases that have been invented in order to control or subdue particular groups or individuals. Consider, for example, drapetomania. I talked about drapetomania in a previous video. Basically, drapetomania was a disease that was invented that to describe slaves who desire to escape from their conditions of slavery. They were sometimes labeled with this supposed illness called drapetomania. I mean, heaven forbid that a slave would want to escape from slavery. Another is oppositional defiant disorder. This is a more modern modern invented disease that's often tacked on to other invented diseases because people who are labeled with these fake diseases end up, manifesting defiance, which, like a slave wanting to escape from slavery is perfectly natural, but psychiatry has taken upon itself to put a label even on resistance to psychiatry. So oppositional defiant disorder, I mean, you gotta hand it to them for their creativity. This is not to say that mental or emotional suffering is not real, but that in many cases the psychiatric labels applied to such suffering can range from seemingly arbitrary to blatantly absurd. Szasz's acute insight was that the roots of modern psychiatry, whose primary figures include Charcot and his student Freud, are planted deep in the soil of a dehumanized and objectified view of patients. Thus, as Szasz demonstrated in his book, quote, Charcot and the other physicians who worked there functioned as rulers vis-a-vis their subjects. Instead of intimacy and trust, their relationship to each other was based on fear, awe, and deception. In sum, Charcot and his acolytes made it easier for sufferers to be labeled as sick, and therefore easier for them to be subjected to coercive treatment. So the early part of Szasz's book, The Myth of Mental Illness, focuses on Charcot and Freud, their relationship, and their invention of hysteria and how that relates to modern inventions of other mental illnesses. I forgot to mention the biographical. Maybe this is a good place to enter into a brief biographical note on Thomas Szasz. He let's see if I can find it. I think this will help understand Szasz and his writing. Yes, it's in the preface of his book. So Szasz writes, everything I read, observed, and learned supported my adolescent impression that the behaviors we call mental illnesses, and to which we attach the hundreds of derogatory labels in our lexicon of lunacy, are not medical diseases. They are the products of the medicalization of disturbing or disturbed behaviors. That is, of the observer's construction and definition of the behavior of the persons he observes as medically disabled individuals needing medical treatment. This cultural transformation is driven mainly by the modern therapeutic ideology that has replaced the old theological worldview and the political and professional interests it sets in motion. We may have already read that, but this is the biographical note. I should mention here one of my childhood experiences that influenced me strongly and played an important part in my writing of The Myth of Mental Illness. Growing up in Budapest in the 1920s, I learned about the famous 19th century Hungarian obstetrician Inyas Semmelweis and his tragic fate. His statue stood and still stands in a small park in front of the city's old general hospital not far from the gymnasium I attended for 8 years. Semmelweis discovered the cause of puerperal or childbed fever before the discovery of bacteria as causative agents of diseases. As he accurately but impolitely put it, the cause was the doctor's dirty hands. Semmelweis also developed a method for preventing the terrifying epidemics of puerperal fever endemic to mid-19th century hospital maternity wards, hand washing with chlorinated water. I was deeply moved by the story of Semmelweis's life, the rejection of his discovery and remedy by the medical profession, inconvenienced by it, and his incarceration and death in an insane asylum. It taught me at an early age, and I just love this little refrain or couplet. It taught me at an early age that being wrong can be dangerous, but being right, when society regards the majority's falsehood as truth, could be fatal. This principle is especially relevant to the false truths that are a basic part of entire society's belief system and that support economically and existentially important common practices. In the past, fundamental false truths were religious in nature. Today, they are mainly medical in nature. The lesson of Semmelweis's faith served me well. So yeah, at the end of that, I think Szasz goes a little too far in his critique of religion, but that the false truths there are a lot of mainly medical false truths. I think is evident and relevant even more today with our current pandemic pandemonium. So yeah, Szasz was influenced by Semmelweis, his work, and I think he kept that in mind as he was working in the field of psychiatry. Basically showing, as Semmelweis showed, with the fever and the doctor's dirty hands, Szasz is showing, the falsehoods inherent in psychiatry. Fortunately for Szasz, he lived to a ripe old age, and he wasn't confined in an insane asylum or anything like that. But he was very courageous and willing to speak out against the falsehoods that he recognized. So back to my essay. Szasz then addressed the social context of medical practice, in which he discerned the social harm that arises from the therapeutic state while distinguishing between private practice and charity practice. So the therapeutic state is a concept in Szasz that's all throughout his work. He even has an entire book on the title of The Therapeutic State, which is a really interesting read. And I think I have a couple of books back here, George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, Brave New World, Darkness at Noon, Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's kind of a few novels and some dystopian literature. But the therapeutic state, I think, is a good kind of description of even what Huxley was showing in Brave New World. We're in that Brave New World now, or something similar to it, and we're in the therapeutic state now, or something similar to it. And Szasz wrote quite eloquently about that. Szasz honed in on the coercive nature of the therapeutic state and psychiatry's role within that state. Quote, in short, the private two-person therapeutic situation maximizes mutuality and cooperation in the relationship between the participants, whereas the public multi-person therapeutic situation maximizes deception and coercion in the relationship among them. In Western institutional psychiatry, as well as in Soviet medicine, Physicians and patients can thus force one another to do things they do not want to do. For example, physicians can coerce patients by certifying them as insane or by certifying or refusing to certify that they are genuinely ill. And patients, in retaliation, as it were, can sue physicians for illegally imprisoning them or can denounce them to the authorities on a wide variety of charges. So, and Szasz has written extensively about comparisons between Soviet um, psychiatry and also Nazi psychiatry and modern American psychiatry. And unfortunately, there are too many similarities to even mention right now. But I think a good point that Szasz was honing in on has to do with, this would go a little more, it would go deeper into philosophy of understanding what is a human being. As Szasz was noticing, modern medicine and, well, corrupt modern medicine and psychiatry have are working under philosophical assumptions about the human person as not as a being created in the image of God with a divine nature and destiny, or with natural dignity and worth, which is the whole Judeo-Christian tradition and the Western philosophical tradition are contribute to our understanding of the human person in this dignified way, whereas psychiatry has followed right along with the reduction of the human being from this dignified as a dignified moral agent to a conglomeration of cells and atoms and a mixing bowl of chemicals and that kind of thing. So let's see. We've got a little bit more in this this review of. Basically, I'm trying to get into the myth of mental illness and give you a good overview. I would obviously highly recommend that you read the book. The first part is the part that I concentrate on, because the second part, Szasz is trying to come up with his own theory of human action, which, I mean, there's some creativity involved there, but I don't think it's as important as the first part of his book. Szasz also recognized that so-called medical care can be used as a form of social and political control. Quote, "It is evident that anything that affects large numbers of people and over which the government or the state has control may be used as a form of social control. In the United States, for example, taxation may be used to encourage or inhibit the consumption of certain goods. In the Soviet Union, medicine may be used to control personal conduct and mold society in a desired direction. Moreover, just as taxation is also used as a method of social control in Russia, so medicine is also used in this way in the United States. Both systems are thus admirably suited for gently keeping in line the discontented and dissenting members or groups of society." Unquote. If this was true when Szasz was publishing his book, could it also be true today? And as I was reading that, I just immediately thought of our friend Anthony Fauci and all these epidemiologists and doctors and scientists who are somehow become the gatekeepers of our society and the elite rulers of our society. And medicine is obviously there is a pandemic, and there is a Wuhan coronavirus that's harming people, but we still can see how medicine is being used as an instrument of social control. In chapters 4 and 5 of The Myth of Mental Illness, Szasz delved deeper into the history of hysteria and Freud's impact on the field of psychiatry. He traced his search for the biological and physical causes of so-called psychopathological phenomena to the investigator's, quote, craving for prestige and power rather than his desire for, quote, understanding and clarity, unquote. By adopting the medical model of illness, psychiatrists were enabled to, quote, share in the prestige and power of the physician. In Chapter 6, Szasz confronted the contemporary views of hysteria and mental illness, concluding that a gulf exists between the, quote, psychologically minded psychiatrists, of which, unquote, of which Szasz was one, and his, quote, organicist colleague, unquote. I think that's clear enough. This book has a lot on Freud and Charcot, and I like Szasz has read a lot on the early days of psychiatry, the fathers of psychiatry, people Freud, Charcot, Bleuler, Kraepelin, and other, Pinel, all these kind of founding fathers of psychiatry. He's read all of their works and dissected them, and he knows exactly what's up with them. Having proffered his criticism of psychiatry, Szasz proceeded to lay out his own analysis of behavior and theories of personal conduct. This is in the second part of his book that I think you can skip without losing too much. Suffice it to say that if psychiatry establishes false premises for understanding mental illness, Szasz may have felt constrained to elucidate a theory to take its place. Rather than fiddling with Szasz's substitute theories, let us understand the conclusions that Szasz himself reached from his research, namely that the customary definitions of psychiatry are worthless and misleading, and that mental illness, as commonly understood, is a myth. So then at the end of my essay here, I just tack on Szasz has a summary of his argument. Maybe I'll read just a couple. 1. Strictly speaking, disease or illness can affect only the body, hence there can be no mental illness. 2. Mental illness is a metaphor. Minds can be sick only in the sense that jokes are sick or economies are sick. 3. Psychiatric diagnoses are stigmatizing labels, phrased to resemble medical diagnoses and applied to persons whose behavior annoys or offends others. 4. Those who suffer from and complain of their own behavior are usually classified as neurotic. Those whose behavior makes others suffer and about whom others complain are usually classified as psychotic. 5. Mental illness is not something a person has, but is something he does or is. And he continues, and there's at least 10 of these things. I would just stop to focus on the first two. Disease can only affect the body, hence there can be no mental illness. This is has been debated, and Szasz has had a lot of criticism for this. I have a book called Szasz and His Critics, where several of his critics, basically try to debunk this idea that illness can only affect the body. And maybe we'll get into that another time, but Szasz's reply is very interesting. Mental illness as a metaphor, that's kind of the basic thesis of the book, the myth of mental illness, myth or metaphor. So I conclude, Szasz's persuasive and provocative book, along with his essay, earned him both effusive praise and harsh criticism. He supplied the argument that mental illness is a myth in response to a question that had puzzled the general public as well as philosophers, sociologists, and medical professionals. A question that may be of more concern today than it was at the time that Szasz published his book and essay. The question, what is mental illness, has often been dismissed, but rarely has it been answered with a kind of precision and accuracy of which Szasz was capable. Even if it has not been fully or satisfactorily answered, it is still a question worthy of discussion. So that's a little introduction to the myth of mental illness, and please read the whole book. There's so much more that I'd like to share. Maybe I'll save these for a follow-up in the next video. But I would just like to, besides reading from or quoting Szasz, let me just say that, um, or add a second witness to Szasz, that it's true. Mental illness, and I understand. Like, I know, I've I've seen, I understand that there are people who, I mean, suffer from all sorts of problems, and they're awful. And I'm not saying that the suffering isn't real. That people don't struggle with a wide variety of afflictions and emotional, or mental, or or spiritual problems. We all struggle in mortality with these things. But the notion that these so-called mental illnesses are illnesses like any other is just patently absurd. Not only for the reasons that Szasz indicates, but also I like to think about it. Think about the human brain for a minute. I mean, we have in university departments, there's neuroscience departments, and there's, in medicine, there's all these brain scans, and like, how much do we really know about the human brain? I mean, we probably know a lot more now than we did when Szasz was writing, or even certainly when Freud and Charcot were proclaiming their false theories about hysteria. Um, but even then, I would say that we know, when compared to what the mystery and uh, the wonder of the human brain, that we know next to nothing. So all of these, you know, invented illnesses are kind of an affront to any, I think, an affront to any intelligent person. Um, not just the human brain in general, but any unique human brain is unlike any other. And not only the billions of, not just the billions of neurons and synapses and how they're connected, but just um, personality and uh, the unique individual that um, that every person is. So it's rather absurd to assume that there's some, you know you know overarching category of mental illness that applies to a broad number of people. These people are bipolar. These people are schizophrenic. Like, come on. Like, let's think clearly about what's going on here. Even, and I'm not denying that people feel depressed or they feel these varying emotions. Those are real. But I think, just to ponder for a minute, um, just the complexity and the miracle of the human brain, let alone the human person, uh, might give us a little pause before we get so excited about applying these pseudoscientific inventions to unique individuals, unique human beings. So I agree with Szasz that mental illness is a myth, and it's more than that, though. It's such a dangerous myth, because not just because of what people like Freud and Charcot have done, but because now that so many people accept this myth wholeheartedly, as if it corresponded with truth and reality. When, as Szasz points out, that was a question that people were debating. Why have we stopped thinking about that? Why do we? I mean, think of the billions of dollars that are spent in, mental health care, and trying to combat mental illness. It's just, I mean, it's mind-boggling. When I think about it, I just have to set it aside, because there's, other than making this video, there's not much I can do about all these government programs and so forth. Um, so that's a little introduction to the myth of mental illness, Thomas Szasz, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, comments, please keep them civil, and please post them below. I'll post some links, and like I said, in the future videos, we'll talk about some of Bonnie Burstow's work, what it means to be, what psychiatry is, what it means to be anti-psychiatry. Hopefully we'll get into talking about the DSM-5 with Gary Greenberg's book, The Book of Woe, and how that was created. And we're starting to put together this picture of what psychiatry is, what mental illness is, how psychiatry developed, what the DSM is, and how we got to where we are today, so that we can see through a lot of the lies and the deception that's out there. And that's that I want to offer this to people, to you, so that you can make your own decisions based on more accurate information than is normally available to the public. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon.